The wool thieves had come to the Ox Place on a Tuesday night in August of 1871, which was how Liselotte Faber knew they were operating in Gillespie County, and which was why she began thinking, in the autumn of 1872, about where to put the wool that was not the barn. Dietrich Ox had lost 3 bags, 300 pounds of prepared merino wool, washed and dried and bagged for the San Antonio market in May, stored in his barn through the summer because he had nowhere better to put it. He had told everyone at the Sunday service in Fredericksburg what had happened, the barn door standing open in the morning, the bags gone, no tracks that told anything useful. 3 bags at $48 each represented $144 of a year's income taken in a single night. And Dietrich was not a poor man, but $144 was not a small number either. He reported it to the county sheriff. Nothing came of that. The wool was gone. Liselotte had listened to Dietrich at the Sunday service and had thought, mine is in the barn too. She had 9 bags from the 1871 clip, and they had already gone to San Antonio by the time she heard about Dietrich's loss. But the 1872 clip would be ready by September, and it would also be 9 or 10 bags, and it would also need to go somewhere between September and May. She was 57 years old, a widow since Carl had died of yellow fever in 1867, and there was no one sleeping in the house at night except her. If someone decided to come through her barn in August, there was not much she could do about it. The barn was also wet. She had understood this for years and had managed it. But in September of 1872 she opened a bag of the current year's clip that she had stored against the east wall of the barn in July, and found mold on the wool in the lower third of the bag, grey-white spots on the fleece, the smell that meant the fiber was compromised. She pulled the affected wool out and weighed what she had to discard, 30 pounds. At 50 cents a pound, that was $15 gone from one bag stored against a wet wall for 6 weeks. The barn collected moisture from the night air against its east wall when the autumn temperature differential was right, and she had known this, and had put the bag there anyway because the east wall was out of the sun, and she had thought the shade mattered more than the moisture. It did not. 2 losses in 1 year. Dietrich's 3 bags to thieves, her own 30 pounds to damp. She thought about both of them through the autumn of 1872, and she thought about the subfloor of the house. Carl had built the house in 1848 and 1849 when they first arrived from Hessen as part of the Adelsverein colonization, the German settlement society that had brought several thousand German immigrants to the Texas Hill Country beginning in 1845. The house was patchwork construction, the German timber frame method with infill panels of limestone and mortar between the structural timbers, 16 by 18 feet, 1 story, with a kitchen and a sleeping room. The floor was laid on vigas, elevated 20 inches above the rocky Texas Hill country soil. The subfloor space was 20 inches high, enough to reach in but not to stand, and enclosed on all sides by the limestone foundation courses and the bottom courses of the wall framing. The subfloor was not entirely enclosed. The foundation and lower wall courses had gaps where the limestone had been fitted without mortar in some sections, and in winter the cold air worked through these gaps and kept the subfloor near ambient outdoor temperature. In the hot months the subfloor was notably cooler than the outside. The earth below it stayed cool, and the shade of the floor above kept the direct sun heat out. In autumn and early winter, the subfloor was at an intermediate temperature between the house interior and the outdoor air, because the floor above conducted warmth downward from the kitchen stove, and the earth below conducted coolness upward from the ground. She measured nothing. She put her hand through the gap that Carl had left in the east foundation course for the drainage of any water that found its way underneath, a gap 4 inches wide at ground level, covered loosely with a flat stone, and felt the air inside on an October afternoon. It was cooler than the kitchen. It was drier than the barn. She pressed the back of her hand against the soil below the gap. Dry, not damp, not the moisture she had felt at the bottom of the mold-damaged bag. The decision she made in October of 1872 was a decision about the wool, not about winter. She was not thinking about Nevada's blizzards when she built the subfloor enclosure. In 24 years in the Texas Hill Country, she had seen snow twice, a light dusting in 1852 that was gone by noon, and a heavier fall in 1868 that lasted 2 days and killed 3 of her younger lambs before she got them into the covered pen. The hill country winters were cold, frost was common, hard freezes were possible, but snow that lasted more than a day was unusual enough that it was remembered and talked about for years. She was not building a snow shelter in October of 1872. She was building a place to put the wool that was not the barn. She bought a quantity of narrow board from the lumber merchant in Fredericksburg, 48 linear feet of 1-inch board, half an inch thick, enough to close the gaps she had identified in the foundation and lower wall courses on the north, south, and west sides. The east side she left partially open because Carl's drainage gap was there, and she wanted to keep it modified. She set a new board above the drainage gap, leaving the gap at ground level, but blocking the larger opening above it. The result on the east foundation, a 1-inch gap at ground level and closed board above. On the north foundation at the top, she left a 1-inch gap between the top of her new board and the bottom of the wall, framing the same gap at the high side of the north face. The air that entered the east gap at ground level would move through the subfloor space, warm as it approached the center, and exit through the north high gap. She had not read about convective ventilation. She had felt, in 24 years of hill country living, that air moved from low to high when it warmed, and that the south and east sides were where the warm air came from, and the north side was where the cold moved. She placed her gaps accordingly. The trapdoor she cut in the kitchen floor in the second week of October 1872, 18 by 18 inches, located near the west wall above the section of subfloor that was farthest from the drainage gap and therefore most enclosed. The hinge she made from 2 iron strap hinges that Carl had kept in the toolbox. The pull ring she forged herself from a piece of iron rod bent in the fire of the kitchen stove on a cold morning. The trapdoor lay flush with the surrounding floorboards. It was visible to anyone who looked at the kitchen floor and knew what a trapdoor looked like. She was not trying to hide it from anyone inside the house. She was trying to hide the wool from anyone who came into the barn. She organized the subfloor space into 2 areas separated by a cedar board divider running east-west, across the full 16-foot width. The wool area to the west, the larger section, 10 feet of the 18-foot depth. The firewood area to the east, the smaller section, 8 feet of depth. Both areas had small pallets, flat boards laid on for short blocks, that elevated the stored items to inches above the soil. This was Carl's method for the root cellar that he had dug behind the house in 1851. Everything on pallets, nothing on the soil, because the soil's surface moisture wicked into anything that rested directly on it. The wool went into the west section in September and October of 1872 as she prepared the bags from the current year's clip. 9 bags, each holding approximately 100 pounds of prepared merino fleece, washed in the creek in April, spread on the rocky slope behind the house to dry in the May sun for 3 days, sorted by quality and packed tight into the burlap bags that she sewed herself each spring. The bags went on the pallets in the west section, stacked 2 high, 3 wide, 3 deep where the space permitted. She came down through the trapdoor to stack them and checked the fit. The bags were stable on the pallets, and the air moved over them. She could feel the slight draft from the east gap crossing the subfloor space toward the north high gap when she held her hand in the narrow channel between the bag stacks and the floor above. The firewood went into the east section as a secondary project, almost an afterthought. She had a good outdoor pile against the north wall of the house, enough cedar, elm, and live oak for the winter, cut by Heinrich Bruns in September as he did each year, stacked in the standard Texas hill country fashion, with the bark side up and the cut faces exposed to the air. The outdoor pile was adequate. She put firewood in the subfloor east section because the space was there, and because dry wood was better than wood that got wet in the November rains, and because carrying 20 pieces down through the trapdoor took half an hour and cost nothing. She put in 47 pieces, 2 to 3 evenings' worth of burning, and left the outdoor pile as the primary supply. The subfloor firewood was not a winter reserve in any considered sense. It was the leftover action of a person who had built a useful space and found something to fill the remainder of it. She did not think about the subfloor again through November or December of 1872. The outdoor pile was accessible, and the weather was the usual hill country winter. Cold mornings, cold nights, some frost, the occasional freeze that glazed the water bucket in the kitchen before the morning fire was lit. She used the outdoor pile as she always had, and she checked the wool bags through the trapdoor twice in November, pressing her hand against the outside of each bag, checking for the softness that would indicate moisture penetration, and found them dry and firm. The subfloor was doing what she had built it for. The 9th of February, 1873 was a Sunday. She walked to the German Lutheran church in Fredericksburg for miles, and was back at the homestead by 2 in the afternoon. The sky to the north was a flat gray that she had not seen often in Gillespie County and could not immediately categorize as routine winter overcast or something else. The temperature had been dropping since morning. By the time she reached the homestead, the temperature had fallen enough that she wore her heavy coat inside for the first hour after she returned, which was not her usual practice. Snow began on the evening of the 10th. She had seen snow in the hill country twice before, as noted, and the first hour of the 10th snowfall looked like those previous 2 instances, light fine, the kind that dusted the live oak branches and was gone with the morning sun. By midnight of the 10th the snow was heavier. She woke at 3 in the morning to find 2 inches on the ground and more falling. By morning of the 11th there were 8 inches and no sign of stopping. The 11th was the hard day. The snow fell without interruption from early morning to late afternoon, accumulating to 14 inches on the level ground around the house. Deeper where the north wind, which picked up in the afternoon, drifted it against the north wall and the outdoor woodpile. She went to the outdoor pile 3 times during the 11th. Once in the morning when the snow was 8 inches deep and the pile was accessible with effort. Once at noon when it was 11 inches and she had to clear snow from the top course with her arm before reaching the wood. And once in the late afternoon when it was 14 inches and the top of the pile was barely visible, and each piece required digging out from under the accumulation that had filled the gaps between the stacked courses. She carried what she could on each trip and stacked it inside the kitchen in the sleeping room. By the end of the 11th, she had enough wood inside the house for the night and the following morning. She judged that she did not need to go out again until the snow stopped, which she assumed it would do overnight. The snow did stop overnight. The wind did not. The 12th of February brought a north wind at sustained 35 miles an hour that drove the loose 14-inch accumulation into drifts against everything that obstructed it. The outdoor woodpile, which was against the north wall, was under a drift of 3 feet when Lisa Lott opened the south door of the house on the morning of the 12th and looked around the corner of the building. She could see the approximate location of the pile by its shape under the snow, but the wood itself was buried deep enough that reaching any individual piece would require digging through 3 feet of consolidated drift with a tool she did not have ready to hand. The barn door, facing east, was frozen solid in its frame. She put her shoulder against it, and it did not move. She had wood inside the house from her 3 trips the day before. She calculated the burn rate in her head. 2 pieces per hour with the kitchen stove at moderate, 3 per hour in hard cold. With the north wind driving against the house walls, the temperature inside would drop faster than usual if the fire was not kept up. She had enough inside for 12 to 16 hours of burning. After that, she would need to reach the outdoor pile somehow, or find another source. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the trapdoor. She had put 47 pieces of cedar elm and live oak in the east section of the subfloor in October. She had not thought about them since October. She had not thought about them as emergency fuel, as winter reserve, as anything except a secondary use of available space. They were there because she had had the space and the wood, and it had taken half an hour to put them in. She opened the trap door and went down through the 18-inch opening. She was 58 years old, and getting down through a floor opening on her hands and knees was not effortless. But she did it, and she made her way to the east section and counted the pieces. 42 remaining. She had used 5 in October and November for convenience on evenings when she had not wanted to go to the outdoor pile. 42 pieces. At the burn rate she had estimated, that was enough for 2 to 3 days of sustained fire. She brought up 12 pieces and stacked them in the kitchen. She closed the trap door. She built the fire back up, and the kitchen temperature came up from the 46 degrees. It had fallen 2 and reached 54 within the hour. On the night of the 12th into the 13th, the temperature inside the kitchen fell again. The north wind had found the gaps in the thatchwork infill that Carl had sealed in 1848, and that had been resealed twice since, and that the wind was now working through in small but persistent drafts around the window frames. She could feel the cold air moving along the floor near the north and west walls. She put on her heaviest wool coat and sat near the stove, and the cold still found her. She thought about the wool bags in the west section of the subfloor. She had 9 bags. She would sell them in May. She could not sell them if she was dead. She opened the trapdoor and went down and dragged 2 bags up through the opening. Each bag weighed close to 100 pounds, and getting them up through the trapdoor was the hardest physical work she did during those 3 days, accomplished in stages with resting in between. She positioned 1 bag against the north window and 1 bag against the west window, pressing the burlap-wrapped wool against the window frames where the drafts were coming through. The effect was immediate and measurable in the sense that she could feel it. The cold draft against the floor near the north wall decreased substantially within half an hour of placing the bag. The merino fleece inside the burlap bags was the densest fiber she had in the house, 1,200 threads per inch by some accounts of the breeds. Fleece fineness, and the 100-pound bags were deep enough that the wind could not work through them the way it worked through a blanket or a piece of cloth. They were not insulation in the architectural sense. They were a physical obstruction placed against the drafts at the precise location where the drafts were entering, and they worked as well as any physical obstruction that size would work. The kitchen temperature stabilized at 52 degrees through the night of the 12th, and held there through the 13th. She burned from the subfloor stock through both days. She went to the outdoor pile once on the 13th. The drift had compacted enough that with a strong push of the arm she could reach to pieces without a tool. But she was careful about how long she stayed outside in the sustained cold and the wind, and she did not make it a habit. The subfloor was accessible in 30 seconds through the trapdoor, and the outdoor pile was not accessible safely in those conditions. She used the subfloor. On the 14th the wind dropped. On the 15th, the sky was clear, and the temperature was rising, and the snow was settling, and Heinrich Bruns came along the track from his property to hers, on foot, because the horses could not manage the drifts yet. He found her at the kitchen stove with her coffee. He looked around the kitchen, the 2 wool bags against the windows, the stack of firewood near the stove that had come from below. He asked how she had managed the 3 days. She showed him the trapdoor. She showed him the subfloor, the remaining wool bags on their pallets in the west section, the reduced stack of firewood on the pallets in the east section. He stood at the edge of the trapdoor opening and looked down. He said, "You built this for the wool?" She said, "Yes," he said. "And the firewood was here also?" She said, "I put it in October. I had the space, and it seemed like a sensible use of it." He said, "You didn't build it for the snow?" She said, "I didn't know there would be snow like this. I've been here 24 years, he said. "But it was here?" She said, "Yes, it was." She had 11 pieces left in the subfloor east section. She had used 31 pieces from the subfloor over the 3 days of the storm, carrying them up through the trapdoor in groups of 5 or 6 at a time. She had brought 20 more pieces from the outdoor pile over the same period, on the days and hours when the outdoor pile was reachable. The subfloor had provided the portion of the supply that could not safely be obtained from outside. The 3rd day fuel when the drift was deepest, the nighttime fuel when she was not going outside in the dark and the cold, the fuel for the hours when going out was not worth the risk. The wool bags, she returned to the subfloor west section after the 15th. She checked them carefully. No damage from having been pressed against the cold window frames, no moisture penetration, no compression damage to the fleece. The fiber was resilient, and the bags had protected it. She sold 9 bags of merino fleece in San Antonio in May of 1873 at 51 cents a pound, and received $459 for the clip, a full and clean transaction. Nothing lost to moisture, nothing lost to theft. The bags had been in the subfloor from September to May, and they had come through exactly as she had wanted when she built the space, dry, intact, uncompromised. She told Wilhelmine about the subfloor when Wilhelmine came to help with the spring shearing in March of 1873. Wilhelmine had been worried in February. The storm had been the most severe in Gillespie County in living memory. The community talked about it for years afterward, and for miles between properties in a 3-day blizzard was 4 miles too far for a daughter with a mother alone on the homestead. Liselotte told her what had happened: the outdoor pile under the drift, the trapdoor, the firewood that had been put there in October without forethought, the wool bags against the windows in the night. Wilhelmine said, "You built the subfloor for the wool, not for a storm." Liselotte said, "Yes." Wilhelmine said, "But it was there when the storm came." Liselotte said, "I hadn't thought about a storm when I built it. I was thinking about Dietrich Ox's 3 missing bags." Wilhelmine said, "And the Lenhar, the firewood. You put it in as an afterthought." Liselotte said, "I had the space." Wilhelmine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And it saved you." Liselotte said, the storm would not have killed me. I would have found a way to the outdoor pile eventually, Wilhelmine said. But you didn't need to find a way. Everything you needed was under the floor. Lisalat said. Yes, I hadn't planned for that. She rebuilt the subfloor enclosure boards in September of 1873, with heavier planking. The uninched thin boards she had used in 1872 had been adequate, but she wanted more permanence. She added a second layer of boards on the north side, the windward face, for additional stability in a future storm. She also added a simple wood latch to the trapdoor to keep it from rattling when the floor was walked on. Small improvements, sensible maintenance. She did not add anything to the system's logic. The logic had already been correct without her having designed it as a storm survival system. She was simply maintaining what was there. The subfloor served her for 11 more years before she moved to Fredericksburg to be near Wilhelmine in 1884. In those 11 years the wool clip went in every September and came out every May. The Firewood Eath section held a reserve through each winter that she drew on for convenience and occasional necessity. There was no storm in those 11 years that matched the February 1873 blizzard, though there were 2 hard freezes and 1 ice storm that closed the outdoor pile for 2 days each time, and both times she drew from the subfloor east section without difficulty. She did not think of herself as having survived the February 1873 storm because she was clever or particularly well prepared. She thought of herself as having survived it because, in the autumn before, she had been trying to protect the wool from thieves and damp, and the same space that protected the wool had held the firewood she needed, and the wool itself had turned out to be useful in a way she had not anticipated. She had not built the subfloor for February of 1873. She had built it for May of 1873 for the San Antonio market, for the clean bags, for the $459 that represented the year's income. February had been an accident of timing and geography. The storm had come. The subfloor had been there. The things she had stored for other reasons had served the emergency she had not planned for. The shelter had planned for her. That was not a statement she was entirely comfortable with, because she was a person who believed in planning and did not entirely trust the category of things that happened accidentally. But the February 1873 storm was what it was. 3 days in which the subfloor she had built to protect the wool from Dietrich Ox's misfortune had also held the wood and the fiber that kept her warm. She had not known it would. It had the specific properties of merino wool that made it useful as an emergency draft seal, and why 2 bags of prepared merino fleece against the window frames of a Gillespie County patchwork house in February, cold reduced the interior temperature drop as effectively as they did. Reflect the fiber's physical characteristics in ways that Lisalat had not explicitly calculated but had not entirely failed to understand. Merino wool, the product of the Spanish merino breed that German Texas ranchers had introduced to the hill country in the 1850s and 1860s, is distinguished from common range wool by the fineness of its individual fiber. Where a coarse wool sheep produces fiber with a diameter of 40 to 50 microns, a well-bred merino produces fiber at 16 to 22 microns, so fine that the finished fleece, when properly prepared, has a density and loft that traps air in a 3-dimensional matrix more effectively than any natural fiber commonly available to a Texas hill country household in the 1870s. A 100-pound bag of prepared merino fleece, packed to shipping density, contained approximately 1,200 pounds of fiber per cubic yard by volume fiber organized in the washing and drying, processed into the randomly oriented matrix that gives wool its characteristic insulating behavior. This matrix trapped air in pockets of approximately 1 to 3 cubic millimeters each, preventing the convective movement of air through the fiber. Mass, that is the primary mechanism of heat loss in porous insulating materials. Cold air attempting to work through a 100-pound bag of merino fleece would lose most of its momentum within the first 2 to 3 inches of fiber depth, because the fiber density redirected its movement into dead-end pockets that the air could not exit without reversing direction. 2 bags pressed against the window frames of a 16 by 18-foot room represented approximately 40 linear inches of window-level coverage on the north and west walls combined. The drafts entering through the gaps in the patchwork infill around those window frames were not large individually. Each gap was perhaps a 1/4 inch wide and an inch tall, but they were persistent and directed. Cold outside air at a temperature below freezing, entering the room at floor level where the temperature differential was greatest. blocking those entry points with a material that cold air could not penetrate easily reduced the net heat loss from the room by the proportion of the total heat loss that those specific entry points represented. Lisalat did not measure any of this. She placed the bags where she felt the drafts, and the drafts diminished. The underlying mechanism, fiber density, air pocket formation, cold air penetration resistance, was real, regardless of whether she had vocabulary for it. She had been working with merino fleece for 24 years, and she knew that the wool was dense, and that dense things blocked wind. She was using the physical property of the material she had available for an emergency application she had not anticipated. This was not a technological insight. It was a practical application of a material's known behavior to an unexpected problem. The specific cost of this application was worth noting. 2 bags of finished merino fleece pressed against wooden window frames in a cold February night were at risk of picking up moisture from the condensation that formed on the glass and the wood, as the temperature differential drove moisture out of the warm interior air. Moisture penetration into finished merino fleece reduced its grade and therefore its value at the San Antonio market. Wet wool tested at higher moisture content than the 18% maximum that the good buyers required, and would be discounted accordingly or rejected. Lisalat accepted this risk when she pulled the bags up through the trapdoor and placed them against the windows. She checked them carefully when she returned them to the subfloor on the 15th. The outer surface of each bag, the burlap, showed some moisture absorption from contact with the window frame, but the fleece inside had not wickered through the burlap in the 4 hours of contact. The bag sold at full grade in May. The question she could not have answered in advance was whether the bags would pick up enough moisture during the window application to affect the May sale. She accepted the risk because the alternative, allowing the kitchen temperature to continue falling through the night toward the 40s, was a risk she was less willing to take. The wool's value was contingent on her being alive to transport it to San Antonio. She made the calculation without naming it as such. The patchwork construction of Lisalat's hill country house, the German timber frame method that the Adelsverian colonists had brought from Hessen, Westphalia, and the Rhineland when they settled the Texas hill country, beginning in 1845, was both the source of the house's warmth in ordinary Texas winters and the source of its vulnerability in the February 1873 storm. Patchwork was a sophisticated construction technique in its European context, heavy timber posts and beams forming the structural frame, with the spaces between the timbers filled with waterland, daub, brick nogging, or in the Texas hill country adaptation, limestone and mortar. The structural system was sound. The visual character of the houses was distinctive and enduring, and the construction was well suited to the moderate hill country climate, where the primary concern was summer heat rather than winter cold. The weakness in Texas patchwork for an extreme cold event was the infill material, limestone and mortar. While thermally massive and adequate for cold nights at 30 degrees, had the characteristic failure mode of all masonry infill when subjected to temperature cycling. The differential expansion and contraction between the limestone infill and the surrounding timber frame opened small gaps at the interface between the two materials over time. These gaps were the paths through which the February 1873 north wind found its way into the house. They were not significant gaps in ordinary hill country winter conditions, when the wind at 10 degrees above zero drove cold air against the outside of the wall, but the temperature differential was not large enough to produce a perceptible interior draft at the gap locations. At 35 miles an hour sustained, with the outside temperature at 18 degrees and the inside at 50. The same gaps produced the drafts that Lisalat felt along the floor near the north and west walls. Carl had resealed the most visible gaps twice in the 25 years of the house's life. Lisalat had resealed them once after Carl died. Each resealing addressed the gaps that had visibly opened, but the patchwork infill system was never permanently sealed at the interface. It required periodic maintenance as the seasonal movement of the timber frame opened the interface slightly each year. In a normal hill country winter, this maintenance cycle was adequate. In the February 1873 storm, it was not. The wool bag's effectiveness as draft seals was therefore partly a function of the specific construction of the house. The gaps were at predictable locations around the window frames, where the interface between the stone infill and the timber frame was most mechanically stressed by the window opening, and were large enough to produce significant drafts, but not so large as to require structural repair to address temporarily. 200 pounds of dense wool at floor level next to the windows blocked the specific gap geometry that the specific construction method produced in the specific storm conditions of February 1873. If the house had been a standard American log cabin with chinking, as most of Lieselot's non-German neighbors built, the gap geometry would have been different, and the wool's effectiveness might have been different. If the house had been adobe, as the Spanish heritage families of South Texas built, there would have been no infill timber interface and no comparable gap. The Thatchwork house and the merino wool and the February blizzard were a combination that produced a specific outcome. The fiber's properties matched the structure's failure mode under the storm's conditions. Lieselot had not designed this combination. She had been living in the house for 24 years and had been raising merino sheep for 15 years and had built the subfloor for the wool in October. And in February all three things were in the same place at the same time. The community response to the February 1873 storm in Gillespie County, and the specific way that story of Lieselot's subfloor spread through the German Texas settlement around Fredericksburg, followed a pattern that was different from the spread of the other storage systems documented in this series, because the origin of the system was different. Every other storage system in this record was built in response to a problem that the builder had already experienced or specifically anticipated. Abigail Marsh built her Rhode Island woodshed after the Leontor collapsed. Rosalia Montoya built her New Mexico Penan zones after measuring the subfloor temperature and connecting the measurement to 30 years of resin observation. Ingrid Svensson built her Utah Territory hatch after watching Eric die. In each case, the builder could describe what she had built and why she had built it, and the description was a coherent account of a problem and a solution. Lieselot's account was different. She had built a storage system for economic reasons, and the system had incidentally saved her in a storm she had not planned for. When she described the system to neighbors in the spring of 1873, she could not describe it as a storm survival system because she had not designed it as one, and she could not describe it as the result of brilliant foresight because she had not foreseen the February storm. What she could describe was the economic reasoning, the ox theft, the mold loss, the subfloor's dryness, the decision to move the wool out of the barn. This was the version of the account that traveled through the community. The community's response to this version was a form of practical updating. If the subfloor kept the wool dry and out of reach of thieves, it should keep the wool dry and out of reach of thieves. Dietrich Ox himself, when he heard that Lieselot's wool had come through the winter clean and sold at full grade, built a subfloor enclosure under the east addition of his house in September of 1873. He built it for the same reason Lieselot had, to protect the wool from moisture and from a recurrence of the robbery that had cost him 3 bags in 1871. He did not build it specifically because he thought a blizzard was coming in February of 1874. 2 other families in the settlement built similar enclosures in 1873 and 1874, all of them motivated by the wool storage problem that the ox robbery and Lieselot's mold loss had made visible, not by the February storm specifically. The storm was an event that made people think about Lieselot and about how she had come through it. But the subfloor system they built in response was the system she had originally built for economic reasons, not a storm survival system. This was the form in which the knowledge spread, as a wool storage solution that had also, incidentally, provided storm resources. The storm was the demonstration of an additional benefit rather than the motivation for the original construction. People in Gillespie County who built subfloor wool storage in the 1870s were building it for the same reason Lieselot had built it. The combination of theft, risk and moisture. Risk that made the barn an inadequate storage location for prepared merino fleece, and they received the storm benefit as an unplanned addition. This transmission pattern, a system spread for its original purpose, with the survival benefit as a secondary attribute, is specific to this account in the series and distinguishes it from every other account in which the survival function was either the primary design goal or a deliberate secondary provision. Lieselot had not planned for the February blizzard. She had planned for the May sale. The blizzard had arrived in between, and everything she had stored for May had served February, and she had not known it would. This was the full account of what had happened and why. The physical properties of the subfloor space in February 1873, and why the space maintained conditions that preserved both the wool and the firewood through the storm, followed from the same principles that governed the subfloor spaces in the Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Utah Territory accounts, but in a hill country context that produced a specific variation in the space's behavior. The primary difference from the northern subfloor accounts was temperature. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Utah Territory, the subfloor spaces maintained temperatures between 30 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit in deep winter because the heated house interiors were substantially warmer than the outside air. Differentials of 40 to 60 degrees between inside and outside drove significant warmth downward through the floor. In the Texas Hill Country in February 1873, the interior-exterior differential was smaller. The house interior was approximately 50 degrees when well-fired, and the outside temperature was 18 to 22 degrees, a differential of 30 degrees rather than the 50 or 60 of the northern accounts. This smaller differential produced a subfloor temperature of approximately 40 to 45 degrees during the storm, warmer than the outside, cooler than the interior, within the range that preserved the wool's fiber condition without excessive heat that might have activated any residual biological activity in the natural fiber. 42-45 degrees was also within the range that kept the firewood above the temperature at which the Texas cedar, elm, and live oak would have absorbed significant moisture from the ambient subfloor air. The wood's moisture equilibrium at that temperature and the IP subfloor's moderate humidity level kept it at approximately 15 to 18% moisture content, suitable for burning. The barn, by contrast, was an unheated single-wall structure with no internal heat source and significant ventilation. From the standard gap handboard construction of Texas Hill Country barn building, the barn temperature during the February storm was approximately the same as the outside air, 18 to 22 degrees. At these temperatures, any wool stored in the barn would have been safe from the moisture absorption risk that the subfloor addressed. Cold air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air, but the 3 ox bags had been taken in August, when the barn's temperature was 90 degrees and moisture-laden hill country summer air condensed on any cool surface within it. The subfloor protected the wool from both the summer moisture risk and the theoretical winter theft risk. These were the reasons Lisa Lott had built it. The February storm added a third use case that she had not anticipated. The subfloor preserved the accessibility of both resources, wool and firewood, when the outdoor storage was inaccessible and the barn was frozen shut. This third use case was not designed. It was a consequence of building an enclosed subfloor space, accessible from inside the house, which was a design choice made for other reasons. The storm exposed the design's resilience in a direction that its designer had not intended to build in. The wool was accessible because it was in the subfloor for the May sale. The firewood was accessible because it was in the subfloor for convenience. The storm made both of these things into survival resources, without either of them having been designed as such. Lisa Lott said to Wilhelmine, "I hadn't planned for that." She said it accurately, and without false modesty. She had not planned for the February storm. The planning she had done was for the wool business, and the sensible use of available space. These plans had been sufficient for February, without having been designed for it. And this was the specific condition that made the account worth recording. That a system built for economic purposes could serve survival purposes it was not designed for, and that the gap between design purpose and actual capability was not a flaw in the design but a natural consequence of building a system that was genuinely useful for the reasons it was built. The year after the February 1873 storm, Lisa Lott began recording the wool clip weights more carefully than she had previously. This was not a response to the storm. She had been keeping rough records since Carl died, but the storm had given her a clearer sense of the relationship between the physical condition of the stored wool and the price she received at San Antonio, and she wanted to track both variables against each other over time. Her record for the 1872 clip, the bags stored in the subfloor for the first time, showed 960 pounds sold at an average of 51 cents per pound, for $489.60 total. Her record for the 1871 clip, stored in the barn, showed 920 pounds sold at 47 cents per pound average, for $432.40. The 1871 figure included a grade discount on approximately 80 pounds that had come in damp and had been reclassified to a lower grade by the San Antonio buyer. The 1872 figure had no grade discounts. She could not isolate the subfloor storage as the single cause of the improvement. The 1872 sheep were a year older and producing more fiber per animal, and the spring weather for the drying period had been drier in 1872 than 1871, but the absence of any grade discount for moisture damage in 1872, when she had stored the bags in a space that measured consistently drier than the barn, was consistent with the subfloor having done what she had built it to do. She noted this in her record and continued the practice. The 1873 clip, stored in the subfloor through the February storm and through the spring, sold for 53 cents per pound on 975 pounds for $516.75. No grade discounts. The 2 bags that she had pressed against the windows during the storm had been in contact with the cold glass and wood for approximately 4 hours and had returned to the subfloor with no apparent fleece damage. She had been lucky with the moisture in those 4 hours, or the burlap had been sufficient protection, or the temperature of the window surface had been low enough that condensation had not formed on it during the contact period. She did not know which of these had protected the wool. She knew the wool had come through. By 1876, she had 3 years of subfloor storage records and 3 years of barn storage records to compare. The subfloor wool averaged $0.51 per pound with no grade discounts across 3 years. The barn wool had averaged 46 cents per pound with grade discounts in 2 of the 3 years. The difference, 5 cents a pound on 960 pounds, was $48 per year. The cost of building the subfloor enclosure in 1872 had been approximately $4 in lumber. The enclosure had paid for itself in the first season and had continued paying for itself at $48 per year in the differential price realized. This was the economic logic that she had been trying to build when she started the project, and the numbers confirmed it. She did not record anything about the February 1873 storm in her farm ledger. The storm was not an economic event in the ledger's terms. It had not cost her anything measurable, and it had not produced any income. She had used 31 pieces of subfloor firewood over 3 days, and she had returned 2 wool bags from the windows to the subfloor stack, undamaged. The ledger showed no entry for February of 1873 that was different from any other February entry. The storm had happened and she had come through it, and the ledger went on. She told people about the storm when they asked, which they did for several years afterward, because the February 1873 blizzard was the most severe winter weather event in Gillespie County in the period. Between the founding of Fredericksburg in 1846 and the time people stopped being surprised by severe weather, which is to say, never. She told the account accurately each time. The subfloor had been built for the wool. The firewood had been there by accident of available space. The wool bags had been used against the windows because the alternative was a cold kitchen and the wool was insulating fiber and she had it available. The storm had not been part of the plan. The things she needed during the storm had been stored for other reasons. They had served the emergency she had not planned for. This was the honest account, and she gave it honestly, without embellishment in either direction, not claiming more foresight than she had possessed, not claiming more luck than would be accurate. She had made a practical decision in October of 1872 that had worked for the reason she made it, and had also worked, incidentally, for a reason she had not considered. The incidental benefit was real. The intention behind it was not. When she moved to Fredericksburg in 1884 to live near Wilhelmine, she sold the homestead to a young German couple, the Benders, who had arrived from Baden 2 years earlier. She showed them the subfloor before she left, the trapdoor in the kitchen floor, the wool section to the west with its pallets, the firewood section to the east, the ventilation gaps at the east ground level and north high positions. She explained the wool storage reasoning and the moisture problem and the ox robbery. She did not specifically mention the February 1873 storm. The Benders would have their own winters and their own reasons for what they stored and where. The subfloor outlasted her. She died in Fredericksburg in 1891 at 76. And the Bender property records showed the subfloor still in use in 1895 when the next owners took possession. Whether it was still holding wool and firewood in 1895, or whether it had been converted to something else, or whether it had been closed off entirely, the records did not say. The enclosure boards that she had built in 1872 and rebuilt with heavier planking in 1873 were in the property, and that was the record of what she had done there. What she had done there was build a dry, enclosed space under her kitchen floor to protect the merino wool clip from damp and from thieves, and add firewood because the space was available and it seemed sensible. The February blizzard had come, and the space had held what she needed, and she had not known it would. She had planned for May and February had been taken care of. This was the account. There is one detail in this account that distinguishes it from every other storage account in the record, and it is a detail about the relationship between intention and outcome that the other accounts do not contain in the same form. Every other woman in this series built what she built because she understood a problem and designed a solution to it. Clara Voss understood that the rain re-wet the outdoor woodpile, and she built the cave platform to keep the wood under the geological overhang. Abigail Marsh understood that her lean-to had collapsed, and she needed interior storage that no neighbor would see and ask about. Ingrid Svensson understood that Eric had gone out in killing cold because the pile ran short, and she built the hatch to ensure the pile never ran short. Each of these was a designed response to a known problem. Liselott Faber built a space to protect the wool from economic loss. The February storm arrived, and the space served a survival function that she had not designed for. She had not planned for the storm. She had not even thought about the firewood in the east section when she placed it there. She had placed it because she had the space and the wood, and it took half an hour and seemed sensible. These are the kinds of decisions that do not appear in histories of frontier ingenuity, because they do not demonstrate ingenuity in the sense usually meant. They demonstrate the accumulation of sensible small decisions that together produce a system more capable than any of the individual decisions was designed to be. What Liselott had, in October 1872, was not foresight about February 1873. What she had was a consistent practice of using available resources carefully and not leaving useful space unused. The subfloor was useful space. The wool needed dry storage. The firewood benefited from covered storage. She used the space for both. In February the space was there, and what was in it was there, and she came through the storm. The account is simple in this way. She had built for one reason. The storm came for another reason, and the building was there.